Despite the variety of arguments, either in support or otherwise, of religious language, its problems are fundamentally approached in two different ways. Either it holds some meaning, whether that be in a religious context or not, or it is almost entirely meaningless. Thus, we are presented with some problems. If we cannot speak about God with meaning, is it possible to have a meaningful relationship with Him at all? What are we really referring to when we talk about God or the divine? How has language developed over time to allow us to express these ideas differently, and what has remained consistent? Because language is ever-changing and differs so greatly between people and cultures, it is difficult to imagine that we can reach any shared objectivity which lies behind our words. While some believe that a case can be made for this, others might resort to more complex ideas surrounding language. Language itself in this topic is linked very closely to meaning, and one of the main areas for discussion in the syllabus is whether religious language itself can in fact hold any true meaning. The via negativa is a theory of language suggesting that positive language is incapable of meaningfully describing God, and hence believers ought to resort to either silence or negative language. Pseudo-Dionysius, for example, suggested the via negativa in his book The Divine Names, arguing that God fulfills all of our categories. This means that everything originated in God, and if he is within everything, he cannot be named by any single thing. In addition, God is transcendent and not literally within anything material. It must be noted that Pseudo-Dionysius is quick to establish this dichotomy, and he finds himself throughout the divine names in a back and forth motion between apophatic and cataphatic ways of talking about God. This is never fully resolved, however the via negativa is one potential thread of logic. It is also something that has been reflected in other Abrahamic faiths, such as Islam, as he cannot be represented in descriptive terms, as that would take away from his metaphysicality. Ultimately, then, the best approach to God is in silence, and we must rely on experience of him only. Experience specifically has been talked about by William James, who stresses God's ineffability and noetic quality. Where Pseudo-Dionysius recommends silence, however, Maimonides, in the Guide for the Perplexed, actively recommends negative language. He argues that we use equivocal language to talk about God, and there can be no link between ordinary understanding and its application to God. This is arguably closer to the via negativa's initial principles. These arguments suggest that God cannot be talked about through language, as it would result in humans trying to relate him to earthly things, which detracts from God's transcendence. The theory is successful in upholding God's metaphysical status, reminding us of his divine nature, as humans sometimes tend to assume that God is in some way like us, which he's not. Pseudo-Dionysius states in the divine names that God must be far beyond mind, where mind turns away from all things. This further argues for God's sense of power and separates him from the human mind, and the via negativa stays in line with this logic. The theory is also supported by Kantian metaphysics, which argued that God is beyond our understanding, which in turn leads us to believe that he is also beyond language, as language is a mere product of the mind. To an extent, it is also sufficient for practicing religion, as it encourages those to seek experience of God rather than to try and relate him to this earth, which is not a true understanding of God. However, there are some clear flaws with the argument of the via negativa. As William James also argued, experience of God should be passive, and we cannot go seeking it out, otherwise it isn't valid. Moreover, on a practical approach, Christians will find it difficult to uphold a belief in a God that's only described in negative terms, as it only increases the distance which they're trying to resolve between themselves and God. The God that is described in their Bible is a God who communicates with humans, and therefore the via negativa takes his power away from him, and might even discourage believers in God. This is because many followers might lose hope in ever connecting with their God through a way which they can understand, through language. This, therefore, only creates a vacuum for practicing Christians. Instead of approaching God in such abstract terms, there might still be ways of understanding him through language, just not in a way which undermines his greatness. Many arguments, of course, have their roots in science or basic observation, arguing that language refers only to physical things. The logical positivist would state that what is empirically true is also meaningful. A.J. Ayer, in Language, Truth and Logic, claims that we must be able to prove something in principle In other words, it must be verifiable in order for it to possess any meaning. This theory, known as the verification principle, states that language must be proven synthetically and analytically. Many have taken issue with the fact that this principle in itself cannot be proven in either of these terms, therefore is itself meaningless by Ayer's own standards. If following Ayer, we might find a conclusion that's empirically and logically incorrect, such as the moon is made of cheese, which would be arguing that this is meaningful just because we know what must be done to prove it. Antony Flew has a similar argument to Ayer, but adds that we must know what we're ruling out when we make claims. In his debate Theology and Falsification, Flew argues that meaningful statements must both assert something and also deny the opposite of that assertion. He uses an effective parable to support this, known as the Parable of the Gardener, taken from Gods by John Wisdom. The main principles of this parable outline that if a believer and non-believer are in a debate, the believer will ignore all empirical evidence until nothing is left of their original assertion, and language begins to lose its meaning. In this way, Flew would claim that language must therefore be grounded in things which are observed. Otherwise, with each step, meaning will begin to diminish. Whilst these arguments are valid, others might argue that things in the world are capable of pointing towards a meaning which exists beyond the world, which is what the empiricists are missing. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, argued that analogical language allows us to talk about things beyond our understanding. Aquinas' arguments are largely based within Catholicism, therefore he addresses the argument entirely in theological terms, unlike the empiricists. He dismisses univocal and equivocal language as he believes that they tell us nothing meaningful about God. Language of analogy, however, allows for the causal link between reality and the world of God, and, though tenuous, he believed this was enough to make religious language meaningful. For example, God created goodness in the world, therefore to speak of the good is meaningful in religious terms. The problem with this argument is that the link itself is unclear, and is hardly ever seen fully in the material world. Now this is where Paul Tillich comes in, as his argument for symbolic language leads the physical to the conceptual. He claims that the language of faith is the language of symbols. Symbols exist in both the world and in the mind, and transcend facts while still holding meaning within themselves. An example such as the cross validates this point. It is not verifiable, but is still meaningful to Christians who believe it symbolizes the crucifixion and the sacrifice Jesus made for humanity, in turn reminding them to be grateful and have faith. The problem with this is that symbols are almost entirely subjective and depend on the individual and the mental connections that they make. For example, only Christians find the cross meaningful. Therefore, it suggests that meaning is only allocated to certain individuals and belief systems, which is quite an exclusive claim. Context, therefore, is very important when determining meaning. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in Philosophical Investigations, talks about what he called language games, arguing that language is based upon meanings which exist within a context only. This is both a cognitive and non-cognitive approach to language, as it argues that language in the grand scheme of things might be meaningless, but within the game it possesses great meaning. Language games are public patterns of language or behaviour which create rules within which words could be brought into meaning. Grammar is the framework of meaning, holding rules under which words can function and be meaningful to the reader or listener. The cross, for example, holds meaning only from what Christians bring towards it, but for atheists it's virtually meaningless. This argument has a strength over something like R.M. Hare's idea of Blix, which argues that we each have an irreplaceable lens through which we observe and understand the world. Blix are innate, whereas Wittgenstein's language games allow for a freedom of understanding and room for change, as once a person learns the rules of a certain game, they are able to understand its language. This allows for religious aspects such as conversion. In uncertainty, Wittgenstein uses the example, "Here is a hand," which is a statement without context possesses little meaning, whereas as soon as either are given or are able to postulate a context for it, it is meaningful. One criticism of this view is that a debate might easily become stifled by the restrictions that a game might cause, and how it might be utilized as a way for avoiding conflict or differences in opinion. A Wittgensteinian response, however, would suggest that thus is the nature of context, and we can observe this sense of restriction and misunderstanding between cultures in the world. There is no objective meaning within language, and yet language games are able to provide these meanings for us. In this way, language is both meaningful and meaningless. From Wittgenstein's argument, it is clear that religious language has the potential to be very meaningful. The issue that might cause confusion within his theory is its subjectivity. However, this is the whole point. Whilst verificationists restrict language in one way, Wittgenstein brings a new sense of restriction that is not bound by the language itself, but by the speakers of that language. It is a much more useful and open way of approaching language, as it allows for societies and cultures to function and change with the times, without being restricted by their language. To venture into the metaphysical in regard to language is all very well, but achieves little when trying to function within a certain context. And this is why Wittgenstein's theory is so successful in upholding meaning in a flexible way. Therefore, philosophers have attempted to prove that religious language is meaningful, and Wittgenstein has succeeded in doing so, in showing that meaning derives from a more personal space in which it's the most functional. This, in my opinion, is a successful solution to the problem of religious language, although, of course, the role of language in the wider, more metaphysical context is continually up for debate.